I, Dr. Rita Pratap, former head of the Department Drawing and Painting, University of Rajasthan, Jaipur, I am going to speak on the history of Japanese art. Module 13, Kana Calligraphy, Onnade. The Japanese regard the development and perfection of their indigenous calligraphy style as the contribution of Heian to art. The Chinese script appeared in Japan in the 5th century AD by the way of Korea. Manyanshu contains 4,500 poems. Onnade feminine hand was the name given to hiragana style of calligraphy. Mother of pearl inlay, raden, was widely used. The relief motifs in lacquer was known as takamake. Prince Shotoku had the articles of state of his newly constructed government written down in Chinese. In the histories compiled in 712 and 720, Japanese names were transcribed syllable for syllable. In the first written history of Japan, Chinese syntax prevailed. The method of transcription was based on what has come to be called the onyomi or phonographic system of sound value. The Japanese regard the development and perfection of the indigenous calligraphy style as the contribution of Heian to art. This achievement is all the more remarkable because of the unbridgeable differences between the Chinese and Japanese speech, poetry, and attitudes towards written script. Between the 9th and 11th centuries, an ingenious system of adapting Chinese characters was evolved and in the hands of courtiers developed into an expression of the highest order.
Since prehistoric times, the Chinese had shown a need and respect for the art of writing ideographic units. Either pictographics or ideographics evolved, each representing a specific idea. They are monosyllabic and were first used by diviner scribes of the priestly shaman kings, such as the Shang kings, dated to 14th century BC, to communicate with ancestral spirits. Later, the deeds of the Zhou nobles were recorded and writing was widely adopted as means of recording such things as military orders, history, and poetry. Chinese verse uses couplets or quatrains of 4, 5, or 7 syllables. Symmetry is bilateral, that is, nouns, verbs, or adjectives, contrasting or paired, appear in comparable position in the respective phrases and thus, when inscribed, occur side by side in vertical columns, written from top to bottom and ranging from right to left. By the time Chinese script appeared in Japan in the 5th century AD by the way of Korea, it was 20 centuries old and standardized.
The Japanese, throughout their millennia of ceramic history, had been content with an oral transmission of poetry and legends in songs and dances. The need for written documents was only felt. The need for written documents was felt only with the advent of a centralized government and its diplomacy. In the 5th century, Chinese books on Confucian classics, the histories, and literary selections began to enter Japan from the 6th century onwards. Buddhist sutras written in Chinese also became known. In the late 6th century, Prince Shotoku had the articles of state of his newly constructed government written down in Chinese, which was learned by the ruling classes. Altek Tungusic Japanese is polysyllabic and agglutinative with a great variety of suffixes for verbs and adjectives. In the first written history of Japan, Chinese syntax prevailed. In the histories compiled in 712 and 720, Japanese names were transcribed syllable for syllable using Chinese characters of approximately equivalent sound value. The Japanese were delighted in the myriad visual puns made possible by substituting one of several visual Chinese characters for the same overall syllable. At first, they resolutely refused to relate the 51 syllable sounds of the Japanese language to 51 standard Chinese characters. This method of transcription was based on what has come to be called the Onnade or phonographic system of sound value. The ideographic system was called Kunyomi. And here the pictograph for fish would be given its Japanese sound value Sakana and would mean fish. Early Japanese writing used both systems as seen in the first poetry anthology, the Man Yoshu, which contains 4,500 poems written prior to 760 AD. But due to the complex and deliberately irregular method of transcription, some of the poems remain unsolved textual puzzles to this day. From the 9th centuries, Japanese writers began to replace this cumbersome method with a syllabic system in which various preferred Chinese characters were reduced to a few strokes each and ready only for sound values. Its angular Kataka Kana form was derived from the formal Chinese Kaishu script and was used in Japan for official documents. Buddhist sutras and printing, its cursive hiragana form, came from the informal Chinese draft script. Teoshu. The katakana syllabary was used for phonetic glosses to Chinese texts and for Japanese written in the Chinese kun system, but needing suffixes, while the hiragana system was developed for use in transcribing Japanese poetry, waka, for the writing of personal letters and for new literary forms such as romances and diaries. Men thought it was unbecoming for women to struggle with Chinese learning, and it became a tacit social taboo for women to be seen holding a book in Chinese. Thus, men engaged in Chinese studies and used Chinese script for the Chinese and Japanese poetry, whereas women wrote only in Japanese. The hiragana style of calligraphy came to be called Onnade, feminine hand. By the late 11th century, as Fujiwara culture was reaching its peak, Onnade achieved unsurpassed internal balance and grace. The example shown here is the Onnade calligraphy from one of the sets of calligraphies. Shikishi album leaf, late 11th century, so-called Masu Shikishi calligraphy, and recalls the pristine purity of the sculpture and murals of the Phoenix Hall. There is no trace of Chinese origin or of the extravagant flourishes to come. The writing was inscribed with a finely pointed brush, usually held upright. Balance and dynamic energy are maintained in the elements of different sizes, in the contrast between light and dark, in column alignment, and in the density and openness of the internal spirals. Furthermore, the work shows creative originality and expressiveness which are never allowed to interfere with legibility. The 31 syllable poem by Kiyohara no Fukayobu is transcribed below line by line as it appears in the calligraphy. Summer night, still dusky, and yet day breaks. O clouds, somewhere among them the moon is hiding, perhaps. Nastu no wo va mada ya na gara, ake muru wo kumo, no izuko ni tuzuki kakura ra na. The thin night air of summer is expressed in the fine lines of the first column. The artist breaks the word nagara, and yet to gain power and momentum in the second column, where his brush tip is freshly charged with more ink and applied with firmer pressure. The letters AK Nu of the word AK Nuru, daybreak, literally expand, breaking apart, the key occupying about 4 times the width of the preceding Nagara, daybreak, thus actually overlaps the no Izaku somewhere of the text column, recreating the clouds which cover the moon at dawn. This poem demonstrates simultaneous confidence in verbal and visual imagery. Not only are the phonetic elements, the Kana, in a non-uniform size, but the inscription does not even conform to the eternal meter of the poem. An oral recitation of it would produce the following liner arrangements. Summer night, still dusky, but already dawn breaks. Oh, somewhere amidst the clouds, surely the moon hides. Natsu no yo wa mada yo nagara, ake nuru wo kumono izuko ni tusuki kakaruru ra na. However, the calligrapher has treated his task in visual, not oral terms. This freedom from extraneous considerations is an essential Japanese quality. The Japanese poet has broken the lines for visual effect. The V-shaped silhouette with serrated edges represents the clouds parting with the short lowest third column emerging in a moon-like circle. The poem was one of pair written in an album format and later mounted separately on cards, shishikishi. Such creative inscriptions of poetry took various forms. These included Tsugi Shishiki, where 2 contrasting sheets of paper provided the background for 2 poems, and large or small shishiki boards mounted with plain or decorated paper, which by the early 12th century had to rival Tuskuri e-painting itself in sumptuousness, as may be seen in the narrative section of the Genji scrolls. 11th century calligraphy paper was used white or light blue. Sutras exceptionally were done in Chinese block script in gold paste on an indigo ground. Japanese paper designs for poetry or prose became ever more complicated. The material could be dyed before manufacture. The paper itself could be dyed or painted with color and then sprinkled with cloudy, misty shapes. Other methods involved the imprinting of ink figures, gold or silver patterns, kirigane, metal flakes, hairline metal silvers, noge, and metal dust, sunago. Colors included various hues of red, violet, indigo, blue, white, yellow, brown, and green. Heian paper often initiated Chinese tongue and song patterns and used the same woodblock printing techniques. The high bird's eye view perspective of vast expanses with low lying hillocks and meandering streams, often associated with Heian landscape painting and paper decoration, had been long considered a Japanese contribution. Igami Yasushi has recently pointed out that such perspective is rare in Japanese works prior to the importation in 1073 of a set of Buddhist commentaries written out by the Chinese Emperor Sung Taichung. He reigned during 976 to 997. And illustrated by 50 Northern Sung artists and then made into woodblock printed editions. The imported book is a Korean copy but faithfully preserves the Sung perspective and marked diagonally. While these characteristics were abandoned in China in succeeding ages, they took root in Heian Japan and contributed features to the Yamato tradition which preserves to this day. Japanese motifs appeared, many of which are still favored today. They include rabbits in autumn grasses, deer, flowing water, a motif traceable to Yayoi times, cherry blossoms, peaches, wild chrysanthemum, and waves. Collage where sheets torn or cut on the diagonal formed colorful designs also became fashionable. Some papers were further decorated by painting. This provided underdrawing for the calligraphy. Almost all Heian secular arts, picture scrolls, screens, or lacquer decoration and fan paintings contain direct or indirect literary references. Calligraphy is naturally the most literature-based form of all. An example is calligraphy fragment on the Shigi Yukushi. Anthology of the 36 poets was produced in the early 12th century and marks the highest achievement in the crafts of papermaking and decoration. It is thought that this collection of hundreds of poems inscribed by 20 calligraphers was intended as a tribute to the retired Emperor Shirakawa on his 16th birthday in 1112. The following example is by Minamoto no Shigeyuki, who died in 1000. The poem may refer to a mature woman symbolized by the buried log who has seen yet another spring come and go, bringing a loveless summer. It is painted in mica and ink upon collage decoration paper. In the center, an abandoned boat, a standard summer subject, is half hidden by reeds. It is painted on a torn fragment of paper inserted between two lighter colored pieces as if it were not of the same world. Above, turbulent mica waves, tiny ink birds scatter, and a small boat carrying two figures head towards a minuscule islands. The calligraphic alignment of the poem follows the speech cadences and complex Chinese characters are used to end the piece with a firm masculine flourish. The calligraphy here differs in several respects from that of the previous example. It is not in Onnade or hiragana form of phonetic symbols, but in the more Chinese-oriented Sogana form, where syllables are mostly made of cursive forms of fuller Chinese character. Secondly, the calligrapher pressed down more on his brush and slanted it from time to time to change the width of the strokes. There is no longer the continuity and flow of the late 11th century, nor the internal balance. The writing reveals self-conscious linkages between words and tight turns around the loops. The calligraphy occupies slightly more than half of the double album leaf format, with the literary source written out completely in Chinese in the last column. However, the Chinese characters are written with the same flowing quality, and emphasis on lateral movement along the writing restricts the calligrapher's freedom in applying his script. There is a link with the heightened, indirectly expressed emotion of Onnade painting. At first glance, the calligraphy is stately and calm, but the agitation betrayed in the second line, Haru ni Edomo, though encountering spring, shows that it is not a straightforward summer boating song, but is resonant with unfulfilled emotions. The harsh breaks within Ida wa Kanu is the first column in the Haru ni a H Idomo in the second are stark and sudden like pearls of thunder on a rainless summer day.
Lacquers made from the sap of a tree that grows in the far eastern countries. Lacquer dries to a hard but slightly flexible and waterproof surface that can be used to protect and decorate a variety of materials. In Japan, there is evidence that it was used in even back in Jomon period to embellish pottery. But this is allowed to dry and then smoothed down with charcoal before applying another layer of lacquer. Many layers of lacquer and many sprinkling of gold or silver can create an attractive three-dimensional effect with the gleaming designs seeming to float like tiny jewels suspended in the clear surface. An example of the above type is a lacquer cabinet belonging to Momoyama period, late 16th century, and at present in the collection of Freer Gallery of Art, USA. This small chest shows a variety of lacquer working techniques with inlay of mother of pearl and nashiji, which involves applying flecks of gold with different coats of lacquer so that the gold particles seem suspended. Other areas show hiramaki, where the decoration is painted on the surface to make a design in low relief. The raw lacquer sap is toxic like poison. Evie and Lendi write the passage that every lacquer worker has to suffer is to develop gradually an immunity to tolerance to the material. This toxicity vanishes completely when the lacquer is dry, and so it can be safely used to make tableware. Working with material is time consuming as it is extremely sticky and has to dry very slowly. Strangely enough, in an atmosphere of high humidity, so lacquer production has traditionally been an activity restricted to the rainy months from May to October. Lacquer has to be applied like paint to a base material, and this is usually wood. In its pure state, lacquer is normally clear and transparent but is commonly tinted with red or black pigments to provide a better background for decoration.
Towards the later part of Heian period, one can find a remarkable development in both technique and design of lacquer. As regards origin of this technique, Make A where color, gold and silver dust or particles are sprinkled to still tacky lacquer. But during Fujiwara period, its use shows that it was indisputably wedded to Japanese taste. The subtle shading of the dust creates nuisances previously unseen in lacquers. As regards its processing, that is, in the earliest form, the design was lacquered hira make, but in the later and more complex form relief motifs taka make, the entire surface of the utensil was covered with several applications of lacquer and color or metal dust. Each lacquer layer was carefully sanded to even the surface and bring out the luster with main motifs rising above the surface. Mother of pearl in long raden was also widely used. As regards the decoration, relatively crowded, evenly spread Tang Chinese motifs gave way to new taste for asymmetrical arrangements and an increased use of empty space. Among the most beautiful examples of Make-A designs, gold and silver is finely wrought in the manner of Heian decoration, and a later example, that is of Kamakura period, hidden writing, ashede, a popular practice, is camouflaged in silver low relief on the rocks, banks and tree trunk. Here the design is more vigorous and technique more complicated. An example is of a flowing stream with small birds, Make-E on Koto, 12th century.
The art of lacquer working has become far more finely developed in Japan than anywhere else and appears in an extensive variety of different styles. It has commonly been used for tableware, particularly soup bowls for various purposes such as holding the brush and ink stick for writing, and those widely called sage mono, hanging things such as small in-row, segmented containers for medicines and so on, which were secured from the obi sash of a man's kimono by a nestuke toggle. An example of a kirin netsuke belonging to Edo period 18th century ivory. This small netsuke is of a seated kirin, a mythical animal similar to European unicorn. Its head turned backward, its curly hair held high against its body. A fine detail in the carving is the kirin's tongue curling up in its mouth. Studios of craftsmen specialized in making lacquer objects, which were from the 17th century onwards, were sold at specialty shops in the cities. An example is of an inro signed by Shibata Zeshi, dated to 1807 to 1891, late Edo period, made up of lacquer. This in-row medicine box consists of 5 compartments. The lacquer technique used is known as ginji, in which lacquer is combined with silver powder here so abundantly that the surface appears to be solid silver. Fine intaglio engraving, partly filled with black and red, depicts a gathering of foxes in the forest. In the background are red gates leading to a Shinto shrine. The depiction continues on the back. Because of its simplicity, one of the most appealing variety of lacquer is known as Ni-goro, which was made by monks at Ni-goro temple in Wakayama prefecture, not far from Osaka. Nigora wares are seen in a variety utilitarian shapes such as serving trays or bowls, as well as objects for Buddhist ritual, which were carved from wood and then coated with layers first of black and then red lacquer. The technique of making carved lacquer originally came from the Shung dynasty, China, and because of its cost, the items made were usually small, such as incense boxes, on a thinly carved wooden box, which would provide the base. Up to 300 layers of lacquer were applied, with each coat being allowed to dry before being painted with the next. The thick layers of lacquer were then carved to leave a three-dimensional design through. An example of the above type is an incense box belonging to Kamakura period carved lacquer and in the collection of Freer Gallery of Art, USA. This technique of carving through many layers of applied lacquer was a sign of the old capital of Kamakura and imitated similar work that had been made in China. The beauty of this piece is enhanced by the centuries' wear, which has revealed parts of the black layer of lacquer underneath. Lacquer lends itself of being used together with other materials in order to create special effects from earlier times. Gold and silver particles have been used to make the maquis a decoration, but pewter, mother of pearl, abalone shell, and even ceramic have also been widely used by the Rimpa artists. Ogata Korin and Honami Koetsu designed and supervised the making of lacquer objects. Ogawa Haritsu invented a process to make lacquer look exactly like other materials such as bronze or ink sticks. An example is a pair of doors with lacquer decoration by Ogawa Haritsu in the collection of Museum of Stuttgart. In these doors, he has made a bas relief design in lacquer imitating decorated sticks of ink. A century later, the prolific Shibata Jushin 1807 to 1891 followed in Haritsu footsteps by also using lacquer to cleverly initiate other materials. In his painting with traditional ink and pigments, he managed to process lacquer in such a way that it could be used for painting, yet remain flexible enough for the repeated unrolling of a hanging scroll.